Welcome to Performance Task Design, Brainstorming, Module 4A.
So now we're going to walk you through the individual steps that we alluded to at the high overview about how do you design these tasks. And really, this is meant for you to kind of build it as you go. Your first step is going to be thinking about what is the content area learning target or targets that I want to be at the heart of this performance assessment. And so as you consider your curriculum and instructional planning for the coming year, some questions you might ask yourself is which unit of instruction or units of instruction would lend themselves well to performance assessment. So think about the scope of the unit, think about the time you have available to you during that unit, and to what extent that time is flexible or not. Obviously, your individual curriculum restrictions will determine kind of where are the best places to fit a performance assessment. Another question to think about once you've identified kind of where in the grand scope and sequence of your course would it make sense to teach or assess a performance task is what are the essential learning outcomes for that unit of instruction. Those are obviously going to be the things you'd want to highlight content-wise in your performance task. Another thing to ask yourself that might help with the time factor is, are there more traditional assessments or summative assessments that you have used in the past that you'd be able to substitute out in lieu of this new performance assessment? And so ultimately, as you kind of consider those things, you'll reach the point where you'll be able to identify one or more content area learning targets. And this is where on your template, you could then add in each of those. So I'm going to keep alluding back to the example I gave in the high overview. In my case, I had one content area learning target. It was modeling with graphs. Students can create a graph that models the relationship between two variables. If I had additional math standards that I wanted to assess in that same task, I would add them in the lines beneath that content area learning target. The next step was to think about, okay, which of the 4 C's might I want to pair with those content targets to really make a more rigorous, more authentic overall task. And so again, what do we mean by the 4 C's? We mean critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And I'm thinking about which of those, or maybe it's more than one of those, pair well with the content area learning outcomes I came with. And so some questions you can ask yourself in doing that are, how might a student use blank, let's say creativity, when applying blank, the content area learning target or targets you've identified? So again, in my case, it was how might a student use creativity when modeling with graphs? How might a student use collaboration with modeling with graphs? And I would brainstorm, all the different things I could think about, because that's going to help me think and evaluate, is that C really a good fit and a good pairing? And that ultimately is the question I'm trying to ask. What's the single or combination of C's is the best fit for this particular content target at this particular time in a unit? And to the extent that I also want to focus on even smaller aspects of that C. So there might be certain things around collaboration or certain things around communication that I want to really zero in on as opposed to the big overarching goal. And again, from there, I would go back to my template and I would add each of those C's as additional learning targets on the 4 C side of that spectrum. So in my example, I added communication, critical thinking, and collaboration. In yours, you may only want to add one of those C's to your performance task, which would be fine. And then at that point, I'm ready to kind of expand my brainstorming to start to think about what are the variety of products or performances that students might demonstrate that could show proficiency in each of the targeted outcomes I've identified. So if you think about those outcomes as the ingredients, we're now going to backwards design and say kind of how could those ingredients go together to create something cohesive, the cake or the item or the meal, right? And so some questions to ask myself are, well, again, what might be the variety of artifacts that you could collect as evidence of learning? And again, there are a number of resources out there that can help you kind of identify artifacts. One of my favorites is 100 Things Students Can Create to Demonstrate What They Know. And so you get ideas like videos, sculptures, murals, dioramas, collages, cartoons, audio recordings, bulletin boards, book jackets, advertisements, blogs. And again, in our digital world today, there's almost an infinite list of possibilities. So kind of thinking through, which ones would be a good fit potentially for my outcomes and which ones wouldn't be a good fit. And also remembering that it doesn't have to be a product as much as it could also be a process. So are students going to have to collaborate? How would I evaluate what that looks like? Are students going to have to present something orally? Are they going to have to perform something in real time? Those are also things that you could have students do and that you could assess as part of a performance assessment. And as you brainstorm the list of possible products and processes, you'll ultimately will want to start to whittle those down to kind of what are your top, what seems to make the most sense? What's the top one or two that makes the most sense? And from there, the last piece is really brainstorming then how do I take that product or that process and really think about how can I make that authentic? How can I tie it to something that students would be doing in the real world? What simulation might I create in my classroom that would, again, really represent the application of that knowledge and the skills in real life? And so just a couple of things to consider. One might be, how could I take and put the students in sort of a real world occupation or a real world role? So how can I make them like a museum curator who's having to take what they know about ancient Egypt and create an exhibit? Or how might I make them a congressional aide who's having to research a controversial issue and take a stand on it? Or how might they become a filmmaker who's doing some sort of investigation and creating a documentary or a artistic film on a particular matter? That's one way you might be able to take that product and give a degree of authenticity around it. A different way of thinking about it is, what are applications right now for students in everyday life? So maybe you position the task around, hey, you are teaching something to a sibling or a family member, or you're making a plan for your own travels this summer, or you are having to choose a budget for yourself or how you'd spend money that was given to you, or create a diet for yourself, or redesign an aspect of the school, right? So thinking about, again, things that students are actually doing right now at their age in their lives, and how you might be able to tie the task that you would be doing or the product that students would be creating to something related to that. A third example would be civic engagement. How might you position students to solve a real-world problem or make some sort of community improvement, and really position the skills and the knowledge that you're assessing around a bigger civic project? Or finally, there's what's called gamification. And while this is arguably, obviously, not real life, it's like, how could I create an imagined scenario or simulation that might engage them in the same way that a real life one would? So if you think about like a video game, or you think about a board game, right, there's nothing necessarily real life about that, and yet it puts the students in a simulated environment that is highly engaging to them. And so is there a way you could gamify your scenario so that the stakes are raised and their engagement level is raised? Any of those are ways to really increase the authenticity of the product or the process that students would ultimately be creating.